Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dorothy here from CCMA. As always, you're very welcome to our Wednesday afternoon webinar. And there's been huge interest in this particular topic today because I think we all need to learn about the future of work. And we're delighted to have Barry Winkless with us, who is an expert and a guru on this area. So want to encourage as many difficult questions as possible, Barry, I think is what we're looking for. But as always, we want to have the event as engaging as possible. So please do put through any questions in the normal panel to the right-hand side that you're all more than familiar with now. And also just to say we're recording the webinar, so we'll make the link available afterwards. And Barry is very kindly going to share a PDF of his presentation after the event as well. So that again will be available on the CCMA members area. But as always, I'm just going to give a minute or two more for everybody to join. And just to remind members that we have another webinar this Friday, which is with Blizzard Entertainment. And I know Anna, one of our speakers, is on this webinar. So Anna, no pressure. But again, it's actually on a similar topic in terms of the future of work, but very much specifically for the Blizzard one, it's going to look at what Blizzard have done in terms of preparing their team members for success and some of the innovative and creative things they've done in the gaming world. So I know that might be of interest to some of you on today's call. So do feel free to register for that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Barry. As I say, put any questions that you have in the chat box. I'll put them to Barry at the end. I think, Barry, you're going to speak for approximately just under 30 minutes, and then we'll have the questions at the end. So thanks as always, Barry, and thanks very much to CPL for your support. And I'll hand over to you now. Thank you. And thanks, Niamh. Sorry, I forgot to say to Niamh too.
Thanks very much, Dorothy. Hopefully people will be able to see what I'm about to present. So I'm going to do what I call a screen check first. Dorothy, hopefully you can see that. You can be my eyes and ears.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Right. Yeah, thanks, guys. Listen, guys, it's really great to be here. And listen, thanks to Dorothy for inviting me along. Really what I want to talk about is what I would call a sprawling discussion around the future of work. But what I'm also going to do is introduce some of our research and some of the concepts that we've developed over the last number of years, and also, you know, working in the real world with large organizations. So look, I mean, I think when we talk about the future of work, I think by and large, everybody would agree that there's going to be some kind of significant impact around this thing called the future of work. And this is from some of our research where most of the leaders that we talk about have either highlighted, you know, impacts as being significant or very significant in terms of the future of work. And that's all fine. But one of the things I really noticed in speaking to different leaders, you know, across different organizations all across the world, is that nobody really has what I would call a defined definition or perspective on what this thing called the future of work is. And obviously with the whole COVID crisis, you know, a lot of the conversation has been around flexible working, you know, how people can work in a, you know, remote, distributed or smart way and all this kind of good stuff. But actually that's only a very, very small part of the story from our own context in the Future of Work Institute. So I just want to start by giving you our definition of the future of work. And I always like to say this is a definition that will make you all sound very clever whenever we get back to actually meeting people in the real world, or even if you're online, you'll sound clever on your next Zoom call. So for us, the future of work is about the purposeful study and integrated design of workplaces, workforces, and work tasks across multiple time horizons in the context of business and society. Now that's a really meaty definition because we need to make sure that we are very comprehensive in terms of any of the work we do on the future of work. But there's a few important words in there. One is this idea of design. So as I like to say to everyone, leaders or otherwise, the future of work is actually in your hands, right? So you can actually purposely design your future of work story. So that's the first thing, this idea of design, and us as designers of our own future work story is one important point of this definition. The second one is these, what we call the 3 Ws, right? Workplace, workforce, and work task. And I'm going to talk to you about those in a little moment. And then the other context is this idea of, you know, the future of work in the context of business and of society. Now, if we think about the future of work, this is what we call our 3W model. And this is one thing I'd really like you to kind of think about and take away from this presentation. If this is the only thing that you take away from this presentation, my job here is done, as they say. And what I'd like you to do is think about the future of work through these 3 Ws, right? Number one is workplace. So that's where the work takes place. And that can be either in a physical space, in a digital space, or a virtual space, right? So, and that's really where a lot of conversations are taking place at the moment around where people should work, right? You know, how can we make a hybrid model work and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not going to talk an awful lot about that today. Needless to say, where things are landing seems to be most organizations, over 85% of organizations, are going to offer a level of flexibility in where the work gets done, and most are leaning towards some kind of a hybrid model. So I'm not going to talk too much about workplace because I think everybody kind of is talking a lot about that at the moment. But the other two W's are equally, if not more important when it comes to the future work. And the second one for me is workforce, right? So how is the overall workforce designed? How is it managed? And how is it motivated? Because there's loads of different things happening at this moment in time in terms of what a workforce actually is. And our own mental and, you know, kind of definition of what that is changing rapidly. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that as well today. And then work task, which is our final W, is the kind of methods, the tools, the mindsets that actually deliver the work, and they can be supported by technologies or something else across there. So when we think about the future of work, it's really important first and foremost that we think about these three W's, because actually it's those three W's that as an organization we can design for greater competitive advantage in the marketplace. Now, I mentioned as well within our definition this idea of the future work in the context of business and society, right? And if you think about business really, up until maybe about 10 to 15 years ago, and you were to represent business as almost a DNA strand, this is probably what it would look like. So we would see the color blue representing order and process, right? All of this kind of stuff, right? Standardization. And then we see a big color orange, which represents things like competition, hierarchy, playing to win. You know, how do we make more money for our shareholders? How can we win in the marketplace? And then over in the corner, we might see some little splashes of green, which represents a focus on community and the environment, equality. And then moving further out onto our genetic strand, this idea of, you know, meaning and bringing your whole self to work and regeneration and all this kind of good stuff. And for a very long time, that really has been the kind of the DNA of most of our organizations. Now, I think what's really important to recognize is that even before the COVID crisis, we were starting to see a change in the zeitgeist, right, in the genetic code of most organizations. More, as I would call, more green, more yellow, more teal when you look at this kind of genetic picture. And that means more of a focus on community, a real focus on things like equality and inclusion, you know, questions being asked around how can we, you know, create experiences for our employees within our organizations, right? How can we actually know more about ourselves as individuals? How can we continuously regenerate ourselves and learn more and more about things? And now we're starting to see this kind of color teal, which is also focused in on evolution and things like how do we create an organization that's almost more like a biological system, right? That we can adapt to big changes. So there's no doubt about it that over the last 15 years, that the actual kind of zeitgeist, the context of business, the DNA of organizations is changing and it is evolving. And there are always good and bad elements to any type of evolution. But it's safe to say that we're going to start seeing more of this type of genetic code when it comes to organizations. And when I talk, one thing I would like you to do is I'm going to do this through the presentation. I'm going to give you some kind of reflection points for you guys to think about after this presentation. I'd love you to think about in your own organization, how would you represent it on a genetic code similar to the one that I'm after showing you there? And also, what lenses are you viewing work through? And do you even know what lenses you're looking through? Because I always like to say we're often captives of the things that we don't actually know. And we're probably using only a small knowledge set to design our organization. So that's the first reflection point. And I think when we talk about the future, there's been pockets of the future all over the place, pointing us in the direction when it comes to organizations over the last number of years. I really love music, and one of the genres I like is classical music. And there was a chamber orchestra called Orpheus from the US, headed up, established by a guy called Julian Pfeiffer in about 1971-72. And I didn't realize that at the time, but now I recognize that they're a very unique organization in the sense that they are an organization that don't actually have a conductor, right? Now, for those of you who know anything about classical music, not having a conductor is almost like not having a CEO. So it's quite a big thing. And one of the things that he wanted to do, I think, from what I've seen, is to create a very, very different model to empower people to be their best, right? So instead of a conductor, they have a rotational idea of a concertmaster. So different people will take leadership roles at different times. You know, the people themselves will, you know, pick the members of new members that come along. If you think about an organization like Orpheus, really their workplace is the home, and it's also in their rehearsal halls and wherever they perform. So this idea of an organization that at its core is self-managing, right? And this is way back in 1971, 72. So we've been seeing pockets of the future of work, you know, across many types of organizations and way beyond the obvious ones happening over the last number of years. And then if we look at the impact of things like technology and platforms, and we take an organization like Quirky, which really is a crowd-based design platform, where the crowd really is the workforce, right? It's supplemented by some designers where people submit some ideas and their concepts onto a platform, and a set of professional designers can design that up, and there's an equal share in terms of how those designs are sold. Technology is really enabling all of these different types of organizations that we really haven't seen before. And we're going to see more and more of this concept of an organization kind of changing. So when we think about this idea of the future of work, it's really, really important that we understand that things are evolving across all of these three Ws, and really in very, very different and interesting ways. Now, I always get asked when I talk about the future of work is, you know, where should we start when we start thinking about the future of work? How can we start thinking about creating this kind of future-focused organization that kind of ticks all the boxes in terms of kind of what we're trying to do? And I always like to say, you know, you start with a story, you know, once upon a time, right? You know, to make it a very simple concept. And I really like this idea of what I call the show Bible, right? And I don't know if any of you follow Stranger Things on Netflix. Any of you do, I'm sure you're really looking forward to the new season, season 4, I think, as far as I know. And this is actually the original Stranger Things show Bible. And a show Bible is what people use to pitch a concept, a TV concept to executives. And generally within the show Bible, you will have images that will represent that TV series. It will cover things like the story, the structure, the atmosphere of that particular TV show. And it's one of the things I always like to kind of point people towards when we talk about this future of work, right? So, you know, when we talk about the future of work, what are you trying to do with your organization? What are you trying to fight against? What are you fighting for in terms of your organization? And in any good show Bible, you will see that they will talk about the protagonists, or the good guys and the bad guys and all this kind of stuff. And there's always good guys and bad guys in stories, right? So I'm sure all of you, or most of you, are aware of Star Wars, where there's a lot of bad guys. There's Darth Vader, there's the Emperor, there's all this kind of stuff. And even if we look at other, you know, popular pieces of fiction or advertising, we see that, you know, in the old Apple ad in 1984, it was really, you know, the organization was the thing that we're trying to fight against. And I always like to kind of say, what are you trying to fight against in your organization, or what are you fighting for? Because actually that is right at the core of the story that you're going to write about your own future of work story, right? So you might be doing something to kind of, you know, decrease productivity challenges. You might be trying to improve a lack of trust. You might also be trying to harness a much, much greater level of diversity within your business. But really, as I would like to say, any good story always starts with what you're trying to fight against, or what you're trying to fight for. And that's a really, really important step when we talk about things like the future of work, because unless we know those things, it's very hard to know then how we're going to design those three Ws, our workplace, our workforce, and our work task, in terms of where we're trying to go with those things. So another reflection question for you: if you were to think about your organization, and if I was to ask you to create a show Bible for your organization, and you were using images to kind of represent what you want it to be, then what would that look like, right? Within that, what would you be fighting for or fighting against in terms of your future work design? What is it all about? And generally what I found in organizations that we work with is that the rule of 3 is really important here, and that you can really only go after 3 big things that you're fighting for or fighting against. So think about that when you reflect maybe after this conversation, right? If you were to pitch your organization's culture or DNA to a bunch of executives, you know, what would your show Bible actually look like? Now, you know, in our studies, we've recognized that there are some big, if I'm going to call it meta trends or meta directions that cut across all of our 3 Ws. And I like to represent that through 3 letters. I would call it more HDT. And by more H, we mean more human. Now, we've gone a little bit further than that because we hear a lot of conversations about people trying to create a more human organization. But in our own research, we have recognized through various working sessions and working on projects that more H actually means these 7 things, right? So number 1, this concept of having flatter structures and more empowerment, removing the hierarchy in terms of how we get things done. A much, much deeper understanding of the human experience. And we are starting to see things like, neuroscience and, deeper levels of psychology being brought in to really understand how things work within any type of organization. We're also seeing a greater focus on experiences and this idea of creating experience that actually matter to people. We're starting to see kind of this focus on an evolved approach to leadership. So what happens to leadership when people are becoming more empowered? What does that change in terms of the role and in terms of what leadership actually means? We're also seeing this focus on a greater level of balance and inclusivity and also authenticity, which is becoming more and more important in terms of transparency and in terms of the types of communications that people have within an organization and indeed without an organization. And then this idea of demystifying technology, but also the ethical use of technology. So where do we get to a point where we've had enough technology? Where do we land on this people versus technology discussion as technology becomes more and more pervasive in our day-to-day lives? And then finally, really this idea of personalization. Now that we've got these various tools, various approaches, various platforms, how do we move away from a one-size-fits-all approach to how we develop our people into a much more personalized developmental journey? So that's the H in our HDT equation, if we want to call it that. The D really is this idea of being much more design focused. And again, what this actually means in practice from the work that we're doing is this idea, first and foremost, is an actual deep focus on purposeful design. So that means designing things with the proper design methodology, where you involve people and therefore make things happen and almost build change into the system. The second one is this ability to holistically look at things and really join the dots across different elements, whether it's across people and purpose and the planet, the community, wherever that is, but starting to really think about how we can join those dots together. I mentioned the idea of a story Bible, but story is becoming more important. So what is our story of the organization? What is the story that we're going to tell ourselves in 5 years' time? What does that actually mean? How do we integrate that across the business? This focus again on inclusivity and user centricity. And any of you guys are involved in tech organizations or any type of technological project, you'll appreciate this idea of user centricity and putting users right at the middle. But that's a much broader concept now in terms of making that work across an entire organization. And then this other last piece really for me, which is really interesting, and we're starting to kind of see in other sectors that are now starting to kind of move into the people space, is not just designing for impact, but also design for emotion and feeling, in terms of making an actual real authentic connection with people. So that's the D in our equation. And then finally the T in our equation is the obvious one, is technology. What does that actually mean? Well, for us it means 5 different things. One is this constant move towards greater and greater integration and a greater focus on frictionless use of technologies. I'm sure all of you have had interesting experiences with different technological platforms that don't exactly tick the frictionless box, but by and large we're starting to see technologies becoming much more easy to use, much more friction free, and integrating and talking to other systems. I think we're going to see more and more automation, both in front and backstage. And what I mean by that is, there's a huge amount of automation going on even as we speak in terms of backstage operational functions. And we're starting to see more and more of that in terms of front stage. So users, employees, using different type of chatbots and different type of automations to do their job as well. We're seeing systems that can now do things by themselves. We're going to see more and more of that. And we're going to see more and more platformization. And we're going to see really that driving this ability for all of us in some way to connect with an infinite amount of people across the world. And then finally, this kind of constant move towards what we're calling the multiverse idea of mixtures of physical, digital, and virtual experiences, in the workplace. So I always like to show kind of this diagram when we talk about this idea of designing the future of work. My uncle used to have one of these big stereo systems that he'd have in his music room, and he never allowed anybody to touch anything. And for each type of music, on the side of this stereo, you would have written down the different places that you would place your particular, equalizer buttons to make sure they got the optimal experience in terms of listening to them. He used to jump in and mess around with his equalizers, which he didn't like very much. But actually, in a way, when we talk about the future work, it's a little bit like that. And I always like to say there is no one story, there is no one design that fits for every single organization. So when we're talking about our future work design, we're really talking about moving our dials across certain areas, certain continuums, across our 3 Ws, in order to design something that helps us to defeat the things we're trying to fight against and support the things we're trying to do, and also create a unique type of a design that works specifically for our organization. And I'm not going to talk too much about that, but in our latest white paper, we have presented our 3W model in more detail, and we've identified what we would call our kind of 15 continuums that are important to your future work design. I'm not going to talk about all those today, but I will give you a link via Dorothy that you can kind of download that paper to get a little bit more information about that. But I am just going to focus in for the moment on the workforce element. And if you remember, the workforce element is how do we kind of design the workforce, motivate the workforce, how do we do all of that kind of stuff. And these are, what we call the 5 important continuums for workforce. Now, again, I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I think a couple of ones I really want to kind of pull out, right? One is this idea of, the workforce moving from this idea of, ownership. So, having very small group of permanent employees, more towards this having access to as many kind of pieces of talent as we can. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that in a moment. The second one is this kind of move from structure of very hierarchical to this more holacracy type model, much flatter structures and much more empowerment in terms of the team. And then another element then is this concept of moving away just from thinking about a job and a package to this whole idea of purposely designing and purposely exploiting an employer value proposition that really resonates with the kind of people that you're trying to attract into your organization. So, one of the things I'd like you to think about well after this presentation is currently, where are you placing your future work dials? And actually into the future, where do you want them to be? And I think that's a really, really important concept. Ultimately, as I said at the start of this presentation, we are the designers of our future work story. So where could we place those dials? Even if we look at that workplace element, what way are you viewing the future of work? And there's a lot of really, really interesting things happening when we talk about this idea of the workforce. If you really think about it, by about 2035, and this is across multiple studies, including our own, the expectation is that we will have over a third of our workforce actually working for themselves, working independently, and instead of working for organizations, working with organizations. I actually think that with is one of the most important words when we talk about the future of work, because when you think about it internally, as organizations, we're trying to empower people and work with them as opposed to getting them to do things for us. And then externally, we're starting to see a big increase in the amount of people working on their own, who work with multiple organizations and work with them as opposed to for them. And there's a number of really interesting things that have kind of happened to make this a real thing, and it's changing what we mean about the workforce. If you all remember, probably, I certainly remember when I got my degree, and my father saying to me, okay, you've had your fun, it's time to go out now and get a job. If you worked with a good organization, then the chances were you could build out a bit of a career. Now, I think what's really happening these days is because of these technology platforms where we can literally create our own business in a few days, and we can literally connect to the world, within a few days, as long as you've got an interesting type of a product, then our expectations are changing. We want an experience, right? We want to have some level of experience that also in some way transforms us in terms of how we view ourselves, and also in terms of the kind of work that we're doing. So we're starting to see a big increase in this idea of the career as a set of portfolio of experiences, a portfolio of projects. So I don't know if any of you know who this guy is, but this is a guy who heads up an organization called Hacksmith Technologies. And really what this guy does is he has a YouTube channel. He tries to replicate various technologies from Star Wars universe and from the Marvel universe and everything else. This is his attempt at replicating an actual and developing a real lightsaber for those of you who are into science fiction. But what's really interesting about him is that he's got a massive following. He built his business through YouTube. He's living his passion. He's created a portfolio of experiences for himself and also for his audience. And we're seeing more and more of people creating their own path as we see greater democratization of platforms and technology, greater access to other individuals. So the next big wave of the workforce actually is this big group of people that no longer work for organizations but work with them. And when we talk about workforce is actually, in this day and age and into the future, actually looks more like this, right? It now looks like we have a core talent group, but we then have this massive network of different types of employment types, different types of relationships we have with suppliers and everything else. So in a way, the very nature of what a workforce actually is changed absolutely significantly over the last 10 years. And we believe that the kind of analogies that we use now for the workshop are going to be more like thinking about the workforce as a network, thinking about it almost as some kind of a superorganism, thinking about it as a community, a club, an ecosystem. Dorothy mentioned at the start of the presentation that a lady was going to be presenting from Blizzard. So this idea of this massive online game, these are better analogies to the workforce of the future than the way we've been thinking about the workforce in the past. And all of these things have massive implications for that one W, that workforce W, in terms of how we think about it. So when we think about the role of HR, in this new future work, it's probably going to be more like managing networks. It's going to be about creating talent clubs that, regardless of if somebody works directly with an organization or otherwise, they're part of something much bigger. So we're seeing big changes in this whole space. I think secondly, and this is from our own research, organizations are going to have to work harder and harder and harder at creating themselves as a destination organization for talent. And this is our employer value proposition model, where really there are 20 core areas that we've identified that are important as to why somebody would choose your organization over something else. And we hear a lot about employer brand and all this kind of stuff these days, but actually fundamentally, employer value proposition is actually a strategic discussion in terms of what your future work design is and what are the things we need to work on to be a destination for the kind of talent that will work and stay with us as an organization, regardless of if they're with the permanent employees or part of this broader workforce network. And ultimately, that is the thing that can kind of create an employer brand that really resonates. So one of the things I always like to say to people is, how good are you at designing experiences, right? This is a picture of the original Disney castle created in 1955. One of the things I always like to call out to people is that, there are people around the world that have over 65 years experience of designing memorable experiences that really matter to people. And this is a kind of a knowledge resource and a set of tools and thinking tools that as professionals and leaders in organizations, we need to tap into if we're serious about tapping into this, ever challenging talent landscape. And there's a whole plethora of methodologies that we kind of need to tap in to really kind of make us a resonant and destination organization. We're even seeing, really interesting things happening in virtual space. This was the most recent Burning Man festival, all created in a virtual space. And again, this gives you a sense of, how sophisticated we are now in terms of the kind of tools that we can use, to create destinations in the workplace, either across the physical space or the digital or into virtual spaces. So another reflection question is, how good is your organization at creating these experiences, and how good are you at creating a destination? How good are you at creating experiences and memories? These are the kind of questions we need to start asking ourselves in this ever expanding workforce in order for us to tap in to the best possible talent. I'm just going to finish the presentation, guys, by talking a little bit about leadership for the future work. It's something I get asked a lot, and it's something we're doing a lot of work on at the moment ourselves. I don't know if anybody knows who this is, but this is a gentleman called Ika Pananen. He's from an organization called Supercell. He calls himself the world's least powerful CEO, and there are a number of these types of leaders emerging over the last kind of 5 to 10 years that have maybe a different perspective on what leadership is. And Supercell as an organization is kind of developed around the cell structure concept where people take ownership in small cells over their own work all the way through to finish. And again, we're seeing more and more of this type of way of thinking. And he would be representative of what I would call a type of a leader that is growing in terms of this idea of the future of work. And I think if I was to show one slide that really represented to me, what this kind of future of work leadership design looks like, I think it's very much around moving to the blue side of the equation. Instead of leaders being this, go-to for making decisions or even collaborative decision making, it's around how do we actually empower employees or that broader workforce group to actually make the decisions themselves. I think that's going to be one of the great challenges over the next 10 years as we think about how can we take the best of directional leadership that's really worked for us in the past, but then how do we actually bring in new elements that empowers people to actually make their own decisions. And I think if I was to really think about, what I would call the three mindsets that I think all of us maybe need to adopt in terms of this future of work, I would call them out as these three. One is holistic, the second one is polarity, and the third is circular. Holistic being this idea of looking at things to try and connect the dots on things, and looking at things from a design-centered way is going to be really important. So thinking about our initiatives as a holistic thing, how it impacts, across not just our people, but our organization, the broader communities within us there as well. It's a really important concept, thinking like a designer. I think the second one that's going to be really important is dealing with seeming opposites, right, as we move into this new world of work. So on one hand, we have to control something, but on the other hand, we're trying to, give freedom to our people. On one hand, we want to be big because we want to be a large organization and play to our scale. But on the other side, we want to act small and agile so everybody feels that they are part of something. And then this third element for me then is this idea of circular. So thinking about everything from the cradle to the grave, thinking about things in 100-year terms, not just in 1 or 2 year terms, and also thinking about this constant idea of constantly regenerating ourselves, constantly looking at ourselves, reflecting ourselves to kind of question and experiment and move forward. So there will be the kind of three elements that I would think about from a leadership perspective. So I'm kind of going to finish up now, guys, just by kind of summarizing some of the things that I think are really important when we talk about the future work and the mindsets and the megatrends. I think number one is when you think about the future work, first and foremost, think about it through the context of 3 W's, right? Workplace, workforce, and work task. All of them are important in terms of how we design our future organizations. And although workplace gets a lot of focus, it is only one part of the equation. Think about this idea of HTT, more human, more design focus, on this kind of evolution of technology, within the business in terms of how things move forward on that. Thirdly, think about your show Bible. What is the future work design that we're trying to create for our organization? And finally, really think about this idea of a new form of leadership as we move into this future of work world. I just want to leave you finally just with a couple of things. The paper Future Work World actually is available via our own channels, complimentary, and that has much more information in terms of some of the things I talked about today. And there's also many other white papers that we kind of develop up in terms of our research and working with clients. And finally, I should say thank you very much. I always say thank you for people that really like to listen to me dribble on for a while about future work. But secondly, thanks to Dorothy for inviting me along today. My details are on the screen there, guys, and I really mean it. Please reach out, connect up, interact on whatever topic you need to have. I very much look at what we're doing as this broader network effect, similar to the things that we're talking about. So please do not be afraid to reach out. And with that, I'm going to say thank you, and I will hand over to Dorothy, which what I hope will be easy questions and not difficult questions, if you don't mind. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Barry, and thanks, Mary. Mary's just put up a comment, very enjoyable and thought-provoking, Barry. So she said, thanks a lot. I suppose the question I'd have, and I know we've only a couple of minutes really to go through the questions, is for companies now, like we obviously are, a lot of our members are contact center companies. They're at that whole stage where they're surveying, have done numerous surveys, back to work, remote work, hybrid model. And a lot of what you're saying there is turning things on its head in terms of the structure that would have been in a contact center up to this, which in some contact centers is very structures, customer service advisors, team leaders, managers, quality, HR, etc. So so if they were to do one or two things on foot of what you've shared with us there and into insights, like, do you have to start at the top in terms of completely refocusing your strategy or leadership, or what? Where should they start, I suppose, is the question I'd be asking.
Yeah, that's great. Always a hard question, Dorothy, but I'll give it a go. Right. Look, I think the first, but genuinely the place you should start with is your story, right? And I know that sounds, when you say story, people kind of go, "Oh God, story, that's really soft." But actually, what we're starting to see now, particularly in many of the organizations that we're working with, is they've lots of stuff, but they don't have a story, right? So as I like to say, lots of treatment, but no treat, right? So it's very, very hard then for people to kind of understand, what are we talking when we talk about the future work? Where are we trying to get to? So I think the first thing I would do is write a treatment, right? So literally write the story of the organization as you want it to be in 3 years' time. That's really, really important, right? So it sounds soft, but trust me, when you get into a room with a few of your trusted lieutenants and trusted advisors and a big part of your organization, you're going to really, really struggle to kind of create that. But that's a really, really important step. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing then for me is to run experiments, right? So this idea of, moving away from these big projects and thinking more about experiments. So for example, what if we removed one layer in our call center management? What would that mean? What implications would that have in terms of the kind of tools that we need to give our people, in terms of the level of empowerment that we need to give our people as well? I should have said as well, Dorothy, that there's huge amount of growing research here in this whole space that's showing that greater empowerment and greater levels of self-management ultimately will create all sorts of advantages in terms of the organization. I think about 15 years ago, when we had the initial jump into self-management and all this kind of stuff, as with all jumps, there were some successes and there were some failures, but by and large we're starting to see that flow towards greater empowerment, greater self-management, flatter hierarchies. So I would say, what's that one experiment that you can run over a 3-month period, that you kind of pick one or two measures, you don't have to go kind of crazy about this as well. And I know from my own experience, very limited experiences compared to many of your members out there, with call centers. For me, it was always around, how do we actually take time back so we can actually be deep with our customers, right? So this has had big implications and all that. So I'd start with the story and then take my next step into an experiment and ask yourself one question: what if we removed? What if we did that? And that's open to anybody at any level. And I always like to say, co-create as much as you can, utilize the people that are going to be part of that solution as part of the design, and you won't go kind of too far wrong. So that would be my advice, just in terms of the first couple of steps, I suppose you call them.
Great, thanks. And Barry, one final question. It's interesting you talk about the company story. We had an event marking International Women's Day, and John Brennan from AIB actually talked really interestingly about each individual having their own story and coming and knowing sort of where they want to be and where they want to go career-wise and work-life balance-wise as well. And actually, I was talking to one of our member companies of financial services last week, and they were saying that they've changed their recruitment. So it isn't so much that they're taking CVs for a particular role. They're looking at a person's skills and seeing where they can put those skills in the organization. Absolutely. So again, for companies who want to, and I know everybody hates the word pivot now, but change the process from what they're doing now to what you're saying the future is looking like. Again, from a HR perspective, what should they be looking at?
Well, I think the first thing, look, we're seeing this a lot, right? So I think I have a lot of time for HR people, because it's a very, very difficult role. Our own HR organization, CPL, is extremely active, but it's also a very, very hard role. I think what we're finding with HR organizations, that they're recognizing now, because of all of these changes I mentioned as part of the presentation, that their role now needs to change, right? So, I think so when we talk about the first step around things like talent acquisition and development, etc., the first thing that needs to think about is HR. What is the role of HR as we go forward? What competencies do HR need to have in this future? I gave a presentation recently where I said, started my presentation, you are all designers now. And really, that's what HR people are now. So how do we design? And the first thing you need to understand is your audience and the kind of audience that you want to work with you. And then you can start thinking about the different changes that you can make. I think in relation to the skills piece, Dorothy, I think we are definitely seeing a move away from what I would call very clearly defined roles. Now, you're still going to have some of that in very technical, orientated businesses, but there's definitely a greater focus on this idea of a bundle of competencies or a bundle of areas, and that really in a funny way is actually the unbundling of jobs that's happening. We're going to see more and more of that, and what I would suggest in that instance is to start thinking about it. That's why I always kind of use the idea of a continuum. Don't jump all the way over to there. What does the first step towards this more idea of a bundle of competencies look like, right? So it might be that your first step is a little bit less about the CV and maybe 20% more around focusing on those competencies and gradually build into something different. There is no doubt about it for me that, it was really interesting with your comment, Dorothy, about people having their own stories. And this is really for me right at the core, because I always have to ask leaders a very simple question. In the future, if I was to give you 10% of the best talent ever of their time for your organization, or 100% of mediocre talent, what would you go for? That is the absolute core question when it comes to the future of work, right? Even when you think, I think now even when you look at Johnny Ives, who was a very famous designer with Apple, and spearheaded a lot of, he himself now works in his own right. I still think he freelances with Apple as far as I can remember. So that is the big question for me, right? So instead of us having to own people within our organization, how do we access them? That changes absolutely everything. Because actually, when you do that, then you really are focusing in on skill bundles. You're not employing somebody because their CV looks really nicely. You're actually employing them because of the quality of their stories, their real world stories, and that specific bundle of competencies that they can bring to bear for where you are in your cycle.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Barry. I'm conscious of time. I know we made a commitment to finish no later than a quarter to.
So not bad as well, Dorothy. I overran my presentation for all that conversations about me keeping time, so apologies for that.
You're fine. You're fine. It was really, really thought-provoking, as Mary said. So just to reiterate, we'll have a recording of the webinar. I think this is one people should share with their colleagues and their peers if they can, and that hopefully will be up tomorrow. We'll have a PDF of the presentation. And just if anybody wants to contact you, I know you're obviously on LinkedIn, but they can come through me as well if they want. And we'll put those white papers up actually as part of the event as well, Barry. So I'll get the links to them off you. And just a reminder to everybody that we're back again on Friday with Anna from Blizzard and Jessica, and that'll be an interesting webinar too. So Barry, thanks again. Thanks to all the team at CPL for all your support and setting it up today. And we hope to see you soon.
Thanks very much, guys. Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.